And good morning. Welcome to our session on sharing experiences from EV associations from around the world. My name is Clive Attwater. I'm the National Vice President of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association. In this time of COVID, we can't travel and bring people together for a conference, but with the wonders of Zoom, we can have people from all over the place in lots of time zones. So we've got people from lots of places, from lots of time zones, and we're going to bring them all together on our Zoom session. Before I introduce our panel, a little housekeeping. If you would like to submit a question, please use the blue question button on the screen and not the chat function. We will try and get answers to as many questions as we can during our time, but time is limited, and we will try and also get answers to questions we don't have time for on air and post them with the conference reports. I'm going to kick off by taking us to Oslo in Norway and Christina Boo, who is the Secretary General of the Norsk Elbeforing, or the Norwegian EV Association for us Anglophones. Christina must be EV Association royalty, being the head of for the past 6 years and of probably the most influential EV association of the world in the country with the most EV penetration. How much better than that can you get? Thank you very much for staying up past midnight to talk to us, Christina. I had the pleasure of meeting Christina in Oslo in January 2016 when I was an EV neophyte. And at the time, she described Norway as being the global guinea pig for EV development, albeit a very willing one. I guess the question is, what do we learn from your country's experiment on the guinea pig, Christina? Is the experiment over? And would you do it differently if you did it again? Over to you, Christina. Tell us about the Norwegian scene.
Thank you, Clive. What a good introduction. Well, a lot has changed since 2016. Obviously, we have moved forward since then. Currently, 1 in 2 of new cars sold are fully electric. We're at 52% so far this year, including plug-in hybrids, 72%. But the last couple of months, September, October, we were past 60% for fully electric cars. So it was a bit lower at the beginning of the year or in the spring because of COVID and the delay of the launch of new models. But now it's really picking up. And what is really maybe the biggest change since 2016 is probably that there's really a lot happening when it comes to infrastructure and charging. Currently, we have more than 3,000 fast chargers, meaning more than 50 kilowatts, and more super fast as well, from 150 kilowatt and up. Currently, around 109 electric cars per fast charger. So it's actually a pretty good. And even the remote locations in Norway. Norway is not as big as Australia, but it's a long country and we have lots of mountains and cold climate. So in the very north, for example, up until recently, there hasn't been any fast chargers, and now we're also getting those there. And it's quite cool to see that last month, the county, Finnmark County, which is the northernmost county in Norway, which is the size of Denmark, quite big, and only 80,000 people living there. Now they're finally getting fast chargers there, and the market share in October was 37.5%. So I don't know if you know this, but the Norwegian politicians have a pretty ambitious goal that was decided anonymously a few years back, that from 2025, in about 4 years, all new car sales should be zero emission, meaning either full electric or hydrogen, including both passenger cars and light commercial vehicles. And some people have been saying, well, but what about the very north? And that's going to be difficult. And now we're seeing that even there, we are almost at 40%, at least if you look at last month, and people are interested in electric cars there as well. So we are way on our way to reach 100%. I think we can absolutely do it, but of course, we still need policies and good politics for a little more. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about us as well, the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association. We this month we had anniversary. We are 25 years old, so we've been around for a long time. But of course, the last 7-8 years has been a really big development. I started 6.5 years ago, and I was number 6 that was hired. Currently, we are pushing 40 employees. So it has been a bit of a startup in a way, a lot of growth, and growing fast is hard, but it's a lot of fun as well. We have also local boards around the country. The different counties have local boards with volunteers that are not paid, but are working to sort of promote EVs and talk to local politicians and so on. And that is something that we have been establishing the last few years. We are been doing a lot of work the last years to professionalize, to offer good membership value. In one way, we are both an NGO, but we're also a business in the sense that we sell a service, a membership. And if people are not happy with that membership, they're not going to renew their membership. We're funded by the members' money. And we're above 80,000 paying members now, and even been growing pretty good this year with the COVID. We are investing a lot in good systems, in membership deals, but of course we're also, which something we've always done, has been working politically, and that is probably something that we use the most resources on, working politically and communication-wise. And of course, helping people, helping members. And Norway has passed from the early adopter stage to just any people buying EVs, and people have a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That's quite an insight and a hard act to follow in some respects. I'm going to move from the far side of the globe now to our nearest neighbor and a much younger EV association, represented today by Kathryn Trounson. Kathryn is the chair of the Better New Zealand Trust, an organization dedicated to promoting EVs in New Zealand. Kathryn is also personally committed to a lower impact lifestyle, of which electric transport is just one part. Kathryn, Australia and New Zealand share many things in common, but we also have a friendly rivalry in things like sports and the like. At the moment, you guys are trouncing the pants off us in terms of EV uptake compared to Australia. Tell us how you do it.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I was quite surprised when you and I discussed the fact that the same number of EVs in both countries only last week. So it is quite incredible, isn't it? Our trust was formed by another EV superstar, Steve West, who in 2015 owned the only Tesla Roadster in New Zealand, a title he retains to this day. And on that first road trip in 2015 from Cape Reinga to Bluff, we are a very skinny country, very much like Norway. Steve employed lots of number 8 wire mentality for charging, sort of utilizing milking sheds, electricity supplies, and charging cables hanging out of motel windows. I'm sure you've all done some of that too. At that point, he decided a fast charging infrastructure was essential to the uptake of EVs, and so ChargeNet was born. It is the dominant player in New Zealand, but Steve is still a trustee with me, despite having a very full day job. Subsequent road trips organised by the Trust were designed to showcase EVs and their ability to travel the length of the country. Looking back now, we can see that the early enthusiasm we encountered was because most of the provincial population had never seen a Tesla in the flesh. So we generated lots of excitement as a result. And it was quite telling that often it was the 10-year-old boys who would explain to their fathers what a Tesla was. Obligation-free rides and drives were a very powerful tool in changing perceptions of EVs. We were definitely selling the sizzle, not the sausage. Today, our members, again, all volunteers, also offer EV education and outreach at many levels in schools and clubs, farmers markets and local fairs. We have been very fortunate to attract expense funding for the Trust from the government body ECA, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. In May 2016, we had high hopes of a national government announcing an EV package when there were just 1,300 registered EVs in New Zealand at that time. The package included an exemption of road user charges until that 64,000 number was achieved for light passenger vehicles, similarly for heavy electric vehicles until they made up 2% of the vehicle fleet. They provided a $1 million fund annually for a national EV information and promotion campaign, and that's where some of our money came from in the reasonably recent years. They also offered a contestable fund of up to $6 million a year to encourage and support innovative low emission vehicle projects. And there was allowing EVs in bus lanes in Auckland. Well, I can tell you that as at the end of October this year, the light EV fleet was just over 23,000 vehicles, with little to no chance of reaching 64 by the end of next year. The government has a handful of EVs in its fleet, although some e-trons have just been ordered, one of which will be used by Jacinda. And the bus lane experiment was run for a year and then dropped, supposedly because it did not materially increase EV purchases. However, as feedback was only solicited from EV owners at the time, you have to question that finding. So the only current subsidy we have is relief from RUCs, and we have been assured we will not pay that until the $64,000 figure is achieved. Those charges would add $7 to the cost of travelling 100 kilometres if the rate of RUC was mandated as that of diesel vehicles. There is a suggestion, however, that EVs may get a different rate. In this new parliamentary term, the government has indicated it will revisit its clean car discount ideas of 2019, which by setting emission goals will incentivise the purchase of EVs and efficient ICE vehicles with an upfront discount on a sliding scale, funded by the imposition of an extra tax on gas-guzzling vehicles. We feel that such subsidies will assist greatly as long as the supply of new and second-hand EVs can be maintained. As we know in the South Pacific, New Zealand suffers from being a long way from anywhere when it comes to importing anything. But the bright spot is obviously that our charging network is a very impressive, courtesy of Steve. 234 stations, mainly 50 kilowatt DC V-fill units, CHAdeMO and CCS connectors, and some 22 kilowatt AC units from local lines companies. Recently, ChargeNet installed the first pair of 300 kilowatt superchargers. In fact, I'm going to the opening tomorrow, and that can charge an e-tron at 150 kilowatts an hour and future-proof the introduction of cars that can take that faster rate to, like the Porsche Taycan, to over 200 kilowatts. There are 9 Tesla supercharger sites in New Zealand, plus Tesla has installed many free 22 kilowatt destination chargers. So I would say the level of EP penetration in New Zealand is due to 3 facts. 1, we rely heavily on second-hand leafs imported from Japan, which offer a low dollar entry into the EV market. We have a single charging network with a simple payment module using an RFID tag or phone app. And of course, our electricity generation is 80% renewable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. Certainly some good lessons there for all countries. I'm going to leap now across the globe again to Alister Hamilton in Edinburgh, Scotland, where it is just about midnight. Alister is the chairman and executive director of the Electric Vehicle Association of Scotland. Alister has a technical nous for EVs, being an electrical engineer and electronics specialist, doing research work in neuromorphic systems at the University of Edinburgh. That sounds fascinating. Alister is also interested in the entropic decay of global fossil fuel production systems, which I take to mean watching parts of fossil fuel intensive economies like Australia fall apart when we don't mend our ways. Scotland's long produced notable engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs in many fields. How is that Scottish brilliance developing in the EV scene? Alister?
Okay, thank you. Well, things are happening here in Scotland, and in the political space, there's a will to take the lead in Scotland ahead of the rest of the UK in getting, very much like Christina's target of 2025, to no more need for new petrol or diesel cars and vans by 2032. And that was, until very recently, ahead of the UK target of 2040, but the UK target has just shifted forward by a decade to 2030. So there's a game of leapfrog going on here. And we're wondering at the Scottish general election next year whether the SNP government are going to leapfrog again, perhaps into the 2020s, and we're kind of pushing for that as an association. So we just need to wait and see what happens. So there's a framework of government targets in Scotland, one of which is the 2032 target, but there's also a fleet target of 2025 for public sector fleet vehicles, which is obviously much earlier. And there's been a great move to renewable energy generation in Scotland. So now the equivalent of 100% of Scotland's domestic electricity demand is met from renewables. And then there are further targets to decarbonise Scotland's railways by 2035, to make the Highlands and Islands region the world's first net zero aviation region by 2040. And that's all on the road to 2045, which is the target in Scotland for net zero carbon emissions. So to help in this, what the Scottish Government have done is put in a charging network called Charge Place Scotland, and that runs right across the mainland and islands of Scotland, because there's many islands in Scotland. So from Shetland in the north through the Western Isles and all the way down to the south and across to the east, we've got a network of chargers, very much like Christina was talking about. And the idea is that everyone should have access, universal access for the whole population, even though the majority of the population is in what's called the Central Belt, the Edinburgh kind of Glasgow corridor. So in doing that, they put in over, it's about 1,500 chargers in total now. So a balance of journey chargers, as we would call them, sort of 50 kilowatts, and some above, but not many on the Charge Place Scotland network. And we have a number of hosts. There's about 250 hosts on the Charge Place Scotland network. And unfortunately, everyone can set their own tariff, which makes for a non-universal kind of charging tariff scene. And as an association, we'd like to see that kind of rationalised somewhat. And of course, there are many other networks appearing across Scotland, including Tesla, Instavolt, etc. So it's quite a healthy scene in terms of charging at the moment, and growing very rapidly. That number is likely to double on the Charge Place Scotland network over the next year and a half or so. So this is the typical charger you'll see on, or chargers you'll see on the network. On the left, we've got 7 kilowatts or 22 kilowatt posts, and on the right, we've got a rapid charger delivering 50 kilowatts. And of course, there's charging hubs appearing across the country. The one on the left is in Falkirk, which is on the A9, which is a branded route that goes all the way up to the north of Scotland to highlight the electrification of electric vehicles in the country. There are many incentives for purchasing an electric vehicle, from a plug-in grant of about £3,000 for new electric cars. We have interest-free loans from the government, which is very effective, and they are doubling every year in the amount of take-up, so £28,000 for eligible cars and vans. We've got no vehicle excise duty on battery electric vehicles. You can get a grant, put in a charge point at home, and you get tax relief if you use the car as a company car. As an association, we are a community interest company. We support the electrification of all forms of transport. We're members of EVA, the European Association for Electromobility. We've got about 1,500 members. We have corporate members also. We've now got a full-time member of staff and one part-time fella called me, and a board of 5 directors. We do a lot of promotion throughout Scotland and beyond. So we take part in conferences and the like, and promotion for anything from an individual charge point to community events to larger events. So some of these pictures contain my board and also Robert Llewellyn, who I believe is featured at this conference. We like to network, and when we go and see Christina, we always remember to take a bottle of whiskey with us. And Dundee in Scotland was awarded the E-Visionary Award for Europe for recognition of their work. And we're members of EVA, and the guys from EVA are on the right-hand side there. We have a membership pack. So like Christina was saying, membership benefits are very important. Thinking of this as a business is important too. How do we make money and thrive? So that's what's going on in Scotland. So thank you very much, and get in touch if you want more information.
Thank you, Alister. And finally, we're coming closer to home, just across the Pacific, to John Stonier on a rainy afternoon in Vancouver, British Columbia. John has a 15-year history with EVs, starting with conversions and driving production cars. He's also very active in business as an entrepreneur, electrifying heavy transport. And he's currently the president of the Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association. Canada shares a lot in common with Australia. Big countries with modest populations, strung out in Canada's case along the border to the south, and in Australia's case around the coast. So we have a lot of common issues in terms of how we, the situation we face. We're also two countries with rather heavier than we'd like dependence on fossil fuels, coal in Australia's case and petroleum for Canada. So what we should be able to learn a fair bit from you, John. What can you tell us?
Thanks very much, Clive. Yes, there is a lot to share between Australia and Canada. And here's some quick facts about us. So we have 38 million people. We have the longest undefended border in the world on the 49th parallel. And our Trans-Canada Highway runs, it is a long way, 7,200 kilometers, about almost 5,000 miles. If you made it into an oval, it would basically be your coastal road around Australia. We have 36 million light duty vehicles. Now, most of our battery electric vehicles are all concentrated in the three largest provinces. Ontario is the largest population. They have 50,000 vehicles. Quebec is got the most cars per capita at 10 per thousand population. They're a heavy hydroelectric, very clean energy. It makes sense for them to go electric. And British Columbia, we like to think of ourselves as the California of Canada, being advanced. And we have 45, almost up to Quebec. We have one little island in the Gulf Islands, if you've been to Vancouver, that I think is our capital for per capita ownership. 267 cars and a population of 10,000 people on Salt Spring. So we're listening to Christina, it's just depressing. I mean, they're so far ahead of us. We're at 3.5 across Canada. It's higher in some of the provinces. We're about 9% in Vancouver. And we're only at 0.5% of total light duty vehicles, and of course, 0 of heavy duty vehicles. So our major issues here, we don't have the supply of EVs. There's no domestic production in Canada. Charging along our highways, obviously we need to get that into place. Residential charging in MURBs, and what I mean by MURBs is multi-unit residential buildings, condos, apartment blocks. Those people are garage orphans. We have some incentives in BC, across Canada, the three major provinces, not a fairly healthy funding available. Ontario used to have a $10,000 provincial rebate. Government changed 3 years ago. They canceled all that. They canceled all the renewable energy projects. So we're in BC, we're basically on par with Ontario, even though we're half their population. The interesting thing we have too is incentives for used battery electric. And as Kathryn talked about how important Japan, Nissan Leafs and stuff are, here in Canada, the same thing. We're picking up a lot of the lease return vehicles out of the United States. They're coming into Canada and they're making EVs affordable. In Canada, some of our federal initiatives have been to help in the funding of DC fast charge networks. This is Petro-Canada, our largest gasoline company in Canada, having their stations with 350 kilowatt DC chargers. The government recently announced some retooling for some of our OEMs. We have Ford, Chrysler, GM in Canada, and they're finally starting to think about going to electric car production. And the government's is also going to be financing 5,000 battery electric transit buses in the next few years. Some expected legislation. The Clean Fuel Standard is a major thing. It's basically forces energy companies to reduce their carbon intensity. And one of the features of it is what's called fuel switching, to actually where you switch to electric and you can get credits. And that's sort of an incentive for credits for going electric. Our national ZEV, we've got 2 of them in Canada, 1 in British Columbia at 2040, and 1 just announced in Quebec at 2035. The national one is pending. So our EV associations, we have about 2 dozen or so across Canada. We're very regionally based because we like to be close together, except for in pandemics. And so we do a lot of personal things. They're mostly all volunteer organizations. I don't think any of them have paid staff. A little bit about Viva, just in my last minute here. We've been around for 32 years. We've got about 300 active members, and we also have complimentary members where we have EV dealerships actually provide a complimentary membership to our association as sort of a perk. And I think it's a pretty good one. We're actively shaping EV policy at all levels of government, city, civic governments, right through to the federal governments. We have weekly meetups and we do outreach. Everything right now, of course, is online. We are the owner caretaker of a heritage EV. And we also host Western Canada's largest annual EV festival. I'm running out of time here, but I wanted to talk about our success stories with MURBs. We've actually got legislation in place where cities are mandated every new building that's a MURB has to have now 100% of parking stalls wired. We still need to work on the legacy buildings. Another one is universal access, and I'll talk about that later if we get onto it. And I'm going to pass by this. I'm going to just show you our 1912 Detroit Electric, our EV ambassador, and our annual Electrofest, which was canceled this year, but we'll be back next August. There you go.
John, I'm very impressed. You said you thought you might run over time and you hit it almost to the second. So hopefully you didn't feel too stressed by that. We got a few questions coming in. I think we'll kick off with the first one here. And this really is about the anti-EV side of the picture. How have other countries' associations handled and overcome deliberate misinformation about EVs from media, government, and vested interests who may oppose decarbonization of transport? Who'd like to grab that? Christina, you're nodding. I'll let you respond first.
I'm happy to grab that because I think it's a very good question, because we have obviously been through a lot of shit during the last years. The good part of the story is that it slowly becomes less. But we've been through debunking myths, and that is probably one of the most important reasons to have an EV association, because there's always, when something new is coming up, people will be opposed to it. At least some people will be opposed to it, and there will be economic. I guess that's also the situation, especially in Australia, that will be even spending money to get this, to promote those myths and and if you don't have anyone debunking them and saying the opposite, that can be actually quite terrible and will slow the development down. And we have been through a lot of debates, and some of them come back year after year. But now I'm finally experiencing that maybe it's a little bit less. People are slowly starting to understand that this is the thing.
Yeah. So even after your far more advanced stage of the process, that's still around, even though it hasn't. It's reduced.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think actually a bit important thing is that we're not just. We have always been focusing on the good things about EVs and not telling people that they are bad because they're driving ICE cars. And I think that is important, that you are talking about what you want to promote and not what you don't like.
Yes, very good. I'm going to pitch this next one to John because I think some of his wins relate to this. What have your associations been doing to advise your national or regional governments about the needs of EV drivers? Examples, the needs of apartment dwelling and public charger requirements. John, you highlighted some wins. Tell us how you got there.
Well, we actually started with the city of Vancouver in 2006, where we happened to have a newly minted manager in the city. He wanted to make his mark in Vancouver and he wanted to make electrification happen. He came out to a EVA meeting one night and said, how can we make this happen? 3 of us got together, and the next business day, over the weekend, we made a presentation to him. He said, well, first of all, we need to have charging ability for people to charge. And the way that the city could work is by mandating that all new developments of condos, apartment buildings, things like that, had to have a minimum level. So this is 2006. By 2009, it had gone through staff committee at the city council, and the city voted almost unanimously to approve a 20%. We started with 100% of all new stalls wired because we're thinking like, this is a 100-year forecast. You need to look 100 years out. But we got 20%. So we're happy with that. And that lasted, that was actually put into place 18 months later. It was April of 2011. And then since that time, we've been continuing to talk to cities around the Lower Mainland. And we've now got that standard to 100%. It took a while, but everybody saw the benefits and they can see the future. And you're building a building for 100 years. It should be wired for 100-year service. So now we have 15 cities in Vancouver, in British Columbia, that require, if you're building any apartment, it's 100%. Every one of those stalls have to be pre-wired or ready to wire in without any back-end infrastructure having to be changed.
So it's about knowing the right person and getting the right message across?
Well, I have to say that Vancouver is a very progressive city. We had a very progressive Green Council that was elected in about 2009. They held 2 or 3 terms and they really made a difference. Made Vancouver a bicycling city, a car sharing city, and now they're actually just implementing mobility pricing. So we're going to have a charge to come into the downtown core. Electric vehicles will be exempt. So we're following what London did 15 years ago.
Yep.
So yes, it's happening here, and it requires that momentum.
Okay. Any comments from Alister or Kathryn on that issue? Yes, Kathryn, unmute.
I'll just unmute myself. I certainly would concur with what Christina said, that we now have big myth-busting posters, which to start with we thought had so much writing on them that nobody would ever want to stop and read them. And yet when we have them out at any of our events, you can see groups of people and you can actually see them pointing at, oh, look at that. And it just sparks a conversation. It also means that people are reading it rather than being spoken to about very much the same thing. And it may seem weird, but you just sometimes wonder whether the written word seems to sort of have a lot more gravitas than the spoken word sometimes, despite the fact that, the spoken word is coming from an EV driver who's been been driving cars for a long, long time. So I think that makes a big difference in the busting the myths. And like Christina, we have the problem of perhaps like you as well, Clive, a long, skinny country, so people say, I need to be able to drive from Auckland to Wellington without stopping. Well, that's a 7-hour drive. Even in an ICE car, you're going to need to stop for a toilet break or a cup of coffee.
Indeed.
It's positively stupid to drive 7 hours and never, ever stop. And yet you sometimes get the impression that that's just the pushback, as Christina says. Yep. People just like to push back and think of a very obvious reason why they wouldn't buy a car.
Okay, I've got another question here, and I think this one must be for John too. What are the issues around universal access to charging stations? John?
So one of our members, Jacques Courteau, as I featured on my presentation, is bound to a wheelchair. And have you ever tried to use a high-speed DC fast charge? There's usually curbs and bumpers and a whole bunch of things. you have to get over. So the universal access is to recognize what we've recognized for sidewalks, curb cuts for sidewalks for maybe 20, 30 years now, and is pretty well universally accepted. We're just starting on EV chargers. So let's do it right. Let's make sure that every EV charger is accessible by anyone. And I came across a woman just the other day she had her i3, a young woman, and she had crutches. And I asked her, well, what do you think about, she's actually working with our group on this. And she told me of how one time she just tripped because she caught up her crutches on the curb and fell over. I mean, and this is a dark, rainy night. I mean, this is why we need that kind of thinking to be put into legislation now.
Have you got any standards or things written up, or descriptions, or
we're
solutions?
Yes, we're working with our local utility, BC Hydro, and they have been implementing this. That picture is the sort of the first prototype, but it's early days. But it's something, just like we have curb cuts in every sidewalk, we need to have universal access so you can roll up to a charging station.
Has that issue come up in other countries? Any of the other speakers?
Yeah, all these issues come up in Scotland for sure. And I think in terms of lobbying and myth busting, I think in Europe things are becoming more organized. Certainly through the offices of EVA, who are trying to support associations in order to myth bust, and this through their EV Motion program, and that's coming from philanthropists who are interested in kind of promoting the greener agenda, just like you get counter forces supporting the fossil fuel agenda. So I think it's a matter of organization and kind of coming together in larger groupings in order to get that kind of critical mass, and getting into the media and using communications agencies, for example, in order to get your message out there, to get on the television and to get on the radio and present your point of view is very important, because you attract interest and you can get a few words in to counter what's out there. Writing articles in the newspaper is also important, just to put that out there. In terms of disabled access as well, I mean, we're going through a series of conversations with political parties at the moment, with our own mini manifesto, if you like, of what we'd like to see parties adopt for the next Scottish general election coming up in May. So that includes things like, disabled access, and adequate provision so that everyone can charge at a charge point. The right to plug, so that everyone living in what we call tenements or an apartment building has the right to be able to have a socket so that they can plug their vehicle into charge if there's a car park, for example. So all these kind of issues come up, I think, right across the board, and it's a matter of how you address them and how you apply pressure.
Now, one of the things that's come up, I noticed, particularly from John's presentation, the provinces with the highest uptake seem to be the ones that had some fairly healthy incentives. How important have incentives been in the development of EVs in each of your countries? Are there particular ones that were critical or that you thought made the biggest difference? In Australia at the moment, we have almost none. I think we're even slightly behind New Zealand in that respect. And it's a case of what are the ones that are going to make a difference? And what do you think about the road user tax being applied from as it were, day one in 3 of our states, at least it's proposed? Who wants to take that on first?
Can I just mention the Scottish Government?
Yeah. Go first, Alister.
Okay, thanks, Christina. The Scottish free loan for not just new electric vehicles, but also now second-hand electric vehicles. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is it's doubled every year the amount that's been taken up in that loan. In fact, they've had to pare back the amount they're offering because of such demand. So that's a very good one. And I'm sure Christina has got even better ones to talk about.
Okay, Christina.
Well, yeah, the only reason why Norway has this high penetration of EVs is because of the policies that we have in place. It's not because Norwegians are more environmentally friendly than in any other country, or I mean, actually, Norway is in a way a stupid country to be the best in the world on EVs. We have cold climates. It's long distances. It doesn't make sense. Still, and right now, 11.5% of all passenger cars on our roads are full electric. And we've starting to see a drop in the sales of fuels. It's actually down about 10% if we compare January 2017 with January this year, so before COVID. So it's starting to have a real effect on climate emissions. And of course, in our bigger cities like Oslo, Bergen, more than 20% of all cars are full electric now. And it's all because of politics.
Yep.
And it's not just about incentivizing, it's also about doing something with the cars we don't want anymore. And to do that, Norway has always, I mean, we've never had car manufacturing, apart from actually some EVs back in the days. But anyway, we haven't had that. So we have had for a long time high taxes on the purchase of ICE cars or of cars. So, and we still do, but we tax the purchase of ICE cars. That's money that the state get in, but we do not tax EVs, fully electric ones. We do tax plug-in hybrids. So it's that simple. In all these other countries, it's still a lot more expensive to buy an EV. In Norway, it's more or less the same price, and that's why people can do it.
Okay, so if we flip that around and say, if it takes incentives or tax breaks or whatever to get EVs to be adopted, are we building a sustainable network? Have we got it? Can we keep these incentives up? How long will we need to keep these incentives up? Are our things like our charge systems, which are largely been subsidized in most countries
Actually,
for their...
Not the case. In Norway, yes, there was some help for the infrastructure in the beginning.
Yes.
Today, it's all commercially.
It's all commercial. So you've made that transition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have the chicken and egg problem at the beginning, but when you get a certain amount of cars, now we have 10 different operators. They're all investing themselves. There's some areas in Norway, like in the north, where there still has been some help, but it's mostly commercially built.
Okay. So if we then take that example of a transition to commercial foundation, do you see that happening for the vehicles themselves, and over what sort of time frame?
EVs will be cheaper in not too long. And the trouble, though, and the reason why we should need the countries to have incentives and to incentivize this politically, is because we do not have much time. We need to cut emissions as fast as possible. And I don't get a grip why not more countries, more politicians are doing not exactly what Norway is doing, because I know it's difficult to suddenly start putting taxes on cars in general, but at least start taxing the most polluting cars and use that money to incentivize the EVs. That's what France has done. That's what Sweden has done. It's a so-called bonus-malus system. It can be done in different ways, but at least start with that.
Okay, so why are the Europeans so far ahead of us Oceania people in Australia and New Zealand, and even perhaps ahead of Canada? Is there something about Europe that makes you more progressive? Alister?
Yeah, can I maybe see something, because I've got an interest in energy depletion. And if you look at the UK, for example, we used up all our coal. It's all gone. There's no, coal mining is now a museum business. You look at oil production. Oil production in the North Sea, in the UK North Sea, peaked 21 years ago. Gas production peaked a similar time ago. So oil and gas and coal are not going to be around forever.
John, you were about to say something.
In British Columbia, we've got a very clean energy grid, but right next door to us in Alberta, they are the tar sands capital of the world. And so there's really different views in Canada. There really is two solitudes. There's people on the West Coast who can buy an EV and it runs great all year round. And then there's everybody else who are driving pickup trucks and there's a lot of pickup trucks in North America. This is a whole culture, and unfortunately, there are no electric alternatives for them right now. Now, hopefully, in a year or two, we'll start to have Cybertrucks, Rivians, and that's going to solve that culture problem. People like to drive trucks. I don't understand it myself, because it's not like they have dirty holding beds. They're all polished up and like showpieces. They're not like work trucks. But that's what we need. We need electric models to go into the truck area, and especially in light duty and heavy duty, medium duty to heavy duty trucks. We're nowhere there yet. There are only prototypes out there, really.
Yeah.
So I see that as a chartered accountant. I see that electric cars really can sell themselves now. There's enough of them around, and the total, if you look at hard total cost of ownership, they're cheaper than gasoline cars now, even without incentives. They are. And you look at our 1912 Detroit, that's our model. You know, how long will electric car last? Well, that one lasted 109 years. Your car should last 50 without any difficulty, and maybe it'll get a new battery in 20 years. But you know what? 20 years from now, the batteries that you're going to buy are not going to be the cost of the batteries today. They are going to be cheaper. And these are all million-mile assets. So I think the value is there. We just need to continue the education and correct the pundits that are always saying, you know, untrue things.
Okay, another question has just come in, and that's a question about the availability of qualified aftermarket and third-party service centers for EVs. At the moment, certainly in Australia, you pretty well have to take your car back to the place where you bought it if you want to get any servicing done. And I think this leads into another aspect, and that is, what about skills and training in EV servicing and charging and charge networks and all of the other new things that we're doing that we haven't done before? Anyone want to comment on that one?
I've been working on a committee of a body in British Columbia called the Automotive Retailers Association, and they're the guys that service cars after the new car dealers sell the cars, and they are making an initiative to make sure that there's training for people to service EVs and everything. One of their members is probably the leading aftermarket service person here in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. And what it takes for that to be successful is you have to have a lot of one car. Now, Teslas are sort of proprietary. They're 75% of our cars here in British Columbia. The next biggest group would be Nissan Leafs. You know, Nissan Leafs, there's a lot of them, and then people can specialize in it. Then it makes sense for them to do things like, okay, we will swap out batteries because there's enough of them around that we can make it economical and profitable to run as a business. So in that sense, you can't have 100 different models of things. You really need to have a lot of a few things to make those aftermarket businesses work.
Okay. Has that been your experience in Norway, Christina?
The thing is, in Norway, is that we went from, in 2012, we had a market share of 3%. This year, we have above 50. This just happened so fast that we didn't even focus on training anyone. Suddenly, just everyone had to sort of get it. So we have never focused that much on the problems with car sellers not wanting to sell cars, or we all have to learn at the same time. And today the situation is that the car dealers that do not have EVs, all they want is EVs, or else they're out of market. You know, and they all have to. There are all a lot of businesses and everything happening in connection to electric mobility. So of course, a lot of people take the cars back to where they bought it, but there are also a lot of dealers that are specializing in EVs, and yeah, you need to have special training, obviously. And we have seen in education that they don't have much of it, but I guess they just have to train at where they work, and it works out. But we also have a lot of another thing that is a bit cool is that now finally a lot is also happening industry-wise in Norway with electric mobility. We have had that for a long time with the maritime sector. We have a lot of shipbuilding and full electric ferries already in place in Norway. We're going to have more than 60 full electric ferries by the end of next year. But now we are getting battery factories. There's also a lot of investment and things going on with battery recycling. So, and also with charging infrastructure. So a lot more is happening with creating new jobs too, which is also really important.
So a comment's actually come through from somebody to say that there's a lot of third-party EV sales and support in New Zealand, Kathryn, which has come from a different route than Norway. Norway had the cars and got the support afterwards, but it's been the other way around. Can you comment on any reason why you think that might have happened? Off mute, please.
Yes, I think it's probably that you know, people who were EV aficionados and advocates could see that bringing in, as I said in my little sort of speech, we're used in New Zealand to importing Japanese used cars, both ICE and EV. So a lot of the Nissan Leafs, and probably half our EVs would be Leafs of different variants. But there were people who were already dealing in importing ICE cars who switch very easily to importing ICE and EV cars. And really, we probably have, I mean, I could probably think of 4 or 5 dealerships off the top of my head in New Zealand who were really started by people who just could see that this was the way to increase EV penetration and still make a business out of it. So these are people, there are 4 or 5 I know of that do not do anything with ICE vehicles whatsoever. And yet they seem to be making it work as a business very, very easily. We've got a couple of organizations. I think Walter Larson is on one of the other committees on this conference today. He in Christchurch and somebody here in Auckland are looking at, you know, rebalancing Nissan Leaf batteries, taking pouches out, putting new pouches in. He's Carl is developing a you know, a 38 kilowatt battery which would slot into a Leaf that would normally have had a 24 or a 30 kilowatt battery. So, you know, there's everybody's just using the number 8 wire mentality that New Zealand is sort of famous for, and just trying to make sure that that happens. So we get so many questions about what happens to the dead batteries, and you know, our response to that is there are no dead batteries. You know, there are so many ways that batteries can be repurposed, reused. You know, if you found a Nissan Leaf battery on, you know, thrown off in a large tip, somebody would have scavenged it before you'd even noticed it was there. I mean, you know, they just, you know, I think there is a terrible tendency to you know, the deniers to obviously concentrate on the bits that they think you can't answer, which is what do you do with, you know, a dead battery. It's not like an Energizer Bunny battery, which is so tiny. You know, they're serious. So
yeah, part of what you were saying there about the people bringing in those vehicles provides the scale that John was talking about in terms of having enough of something to work on and specialize in, doesn't it? Because they're bringing in that flow of, in your case, Leafs. They've got then the expertise around that particular vehicle.
Indeed.
Planes, boats. Christina's talked about ferries. John Stonier, I know you're into heavy trucks. What's happening in the non-car scene? How are we seeing that develop? Pickup trucks kind of on the way, a bit slow, but are we seeing much progress? Alister, you talked about the Scottish government's policy of having a zero emission air network within the centre of Scotland. How is that going to develop?
Well, there are a lot of very short flights in Scotland. You know, for example, between the islands, I think one of the world's shortest flights is just between 2 of the Orkney Islands. It's literally you go up and come back down again. So in terms of, you know, the sort of, and passenger numbers are not high for these flights typically. So there are, you know, planes out there already that will do that kind of thing. But the other big area is just other areas of e-mobility. You know, for example, electric bikes are big. And there's a lot of incentivization going on in Scotland for that. You can get loans to get an e-bike, for example, from the Scottish government, or businesses are being incentivized for that kind of last mile kind of cargo business. So the whole e-mobility thing, you know, from drones and electric scooters and electric bikes is kind of changing the whole kind of micro mobility scene.
We've got some dealers in Australia that sell electric bikes, and they've described them as the new toilet paper. Basically, they can sell them much faster than they can get them. So that's one area.
You get the same if you go on an electric bike. You get the same smile when you come off from people who've just experienced it for the first time as you do from someone driving an electric car.
And we do have a few
They're
sessions on e-bikes later in our conference today. I see our time is just now drawing to a close. So I think at this point, I'd like to say thank you to our participants, and thank you particularly for you in Scotland and Norway for staying up so late in the night for us. I appreciate that. A bit easier for you, John, over there in the afternoon in Vancouver. But hopefully some of you can stay on with us for the rest of the conference or for more of the activity. I'd also like to just draw attention before we close our session to our sponsors. You can't mingle with delegates during their breaks. So you can go get a cup of coffee, use the toilet, whatever, but have a click on their website and their links, particularly the State Government of Victoria, who've been a major partner in our conference, without which this wouldn't have proceeded. A shout out to JetCharge, a supplier and installer of charging solutions for home, business, fleet, and networks. To EV Networks, developing a national public fast charge network around Australia. Femur, one of the world's largest manufacturers of solar inverters and e-mobility solutions, and Transport Mutual Credit Union, providing finance for green transport and the energy transition. Again, without their support, this conference would not have been possible. So thank you once again to our international guests. Some fantastic learnings there. We do have a few questions we didn't get to, not too many. We might just circulate those for your comments after the event. Thank you again.